Great. Well, that was actually really interesting for me because I've been working in the space of Web3, loosely called crypto, but there's more to it than just the finance side. So that's kind of what I'm here to shed some light on. And as April said, I'm a social technologist with a background actually in clinical social work. So I've had an interesting path to getting into working in collaborative software. And I actually went to Loyola University of Chicago for a master's degree. So I think you guys are all in the right place. And I lived in Chicago for over 10 years. So it's nice to be in a room with Chicagoans. So I worked in health consulting for about a decade. And what happened was I found myself super interested in the tooling that people use to coordinate and to facilitate social interaction. So in the health world, we didn't have access to a lot of like high-end tech. And I actually was working at IBM Watson Health for a while, which might seem kind of like it wouldn't make any sense that we don't have access to tooling, but we worked with Microsoft Office, like basic tools. And I live with a partner who's worked in software development for over 20 years. And I just got curious, what's going on over there? How is it different from what I'm experiencing on the software side or on the healthcare side? So that's a little bit of my background and what I'm bringing to you today. And what I'm hoping to talk about is what Web3 is. So, and before I jump in, I'm going to zoom out and just give you a little bit of a view into what the presentation looks like and the software that I'm using to present. I'm seeing April's face light up. I decided to go with a kind of non-traditional route, which is kind of a networked web-like structure, which is the topic that I'm going to be covering for a couple reasons. One, because that's the content that I'm covering, but also because I wanted to share this piece of software. It's called Figma. I don't know if anyone's heard of it or used it before. It's a design tool, and it's super easy to mock up flowcharts and organize information in a more canvas model, which is a nice differentiator from Google Docs if you're feeling like, you want some spatial movement. So this is Figma, specifically FigJam is the name of the file type. And there's multiple different ways that you can go through the presentation. So it's not linear. Of course, I'm going to take one route through it, but April shared the link with you. So feel free to kind of go through the different flows. I've embedded resources throughout. So take a look. It's interesting. You can kind of take shortcuts as you see fit. I've connected some of the dots for how I made connections myself. So John just gave us this backdrop on DeFi and crypto. And what I'm going to do is zoom out a little bit and talk about the bigger context of Web3. So what is Web3? How do we situate DeFi within that? And I'll also get into a little bit on social technology as well. It's a short presentation, but I'm hoping at the end you'll better understand the evolution that we've seen going from the internet to the web, and then from Web 1.0 to 2.0 to Web 3 now. I'm also hoping you'll better understand how digital technical innovation of Web 3 is inextricably linked not only to social, but also financial tech innovation. And lastly, that you'll better understand the impact of the peer-to-peer connection through Web3, and I'll take a specific look at this lens of social technology. So we'll start with a little bit of history. And I know for me, I don't come from a computer science background. I am not a digital technologist. So oftentimes it helps me to kind of situate in what is the foundation? Where did this come from? How did we get here? So we'll do a little bit of a walk down history lane. So starting with the internet really is a hardware innovation primarily. So it's the networking of computers, networks, devices, getting all of those things plugged together. So primarily in the beginning, governmental and defense research networks could talk to each other, and then shortly after, academic researchers. Makes sense. These people were highly technical, so the information that they're sharing is just raw data. Getting it from point A to point B, we can understand why that was important and useful. After that came the web, and the web it sort of introduced a global software platform to the hardware of the internet. It basically brought the internet to the people effectively. And one of the big technical innovations here was the graphical user interface, or a GUI, which is what we're using right now to see each other, to interact with each other. So giving it the internet this kind of face and this interactivity layer where we could display images, people could submit and process forms. This feels more like how people communicate. It gave us a way of interacting with each other, which is obviously pretty cool. It's awesome that we can do this and not be in the same place and still communicate. Both of them use protocols, sets of like standardized code that help different pieces of the internet, different pieces of the web communicate. All of it is decentralized, so people don't have to get together in one central location. There's no central entity that is governing how the internet and the web work, which is pretty cool as well. It's a lot of different entities that work alongside each other and interoperate to bring to life this experience that we're having. I think as far as technical innovations go, this is a pretty cool one. So I'll take us through a little bit of the history of the web then. And we'll start with Web 1.0, which emerged around 1990. Pretty basic, like very simple websites, basic display of information, and it was just sharing information. You can kind of think of it as a one-way street. Personal blogs, company websites. When I think about it now, it seems kind of quaint almost, but at the time it must have been amazing that you could see information from anywhere in the world and you're sitting there in your house on your computer. I mean, it must have been, the experience of that was probably astonishing. I think for some of us that grew up alongside the internet, it's a little bit of a different experience, but watching this come to life, watching the screen come to life was probably really cool. And it's evolved from there. So from Web 1.0 to Web 2.0, which emerged around 2004, the web gets way more interactive. So this is where things turn into more of a two-way street, whereas Web 1.0 was a one-way street. The simplest way of thinking about this is commenting on blogs. So we're now having a conversation. You can share information, but then you can also receive feedback back in. The kind of culmination of what this looks like are the massive global social networks that we have, global service platforms, and the predominant way that they organize information and the data that's flowing through these entities is through centralized databases. And those are primarily housed within companies or intermediaries, trusted third parties. And it makes sense that we would have these trusted third parties, intermediaries, because we're negotiating social interactions. There has to be some kind of trust. So we had these entities come in, they're serving as a facilitator. They're saying, you can trust us to do something. Imagine when Airbnb first came out, you're just gonna stay in someone's house randomly. Like, how do you know you can trust them? The company's coming forward and they're saying, we'll stand in as the trust intermediary. We'll facilitate the transaction. You can go stay in this person's house. The money flows, the whole shebang. So not all of Web 2.0 works through centralized databases, but this has become the predominant organizing pattern. And I'm not going to get into all of the nuance around market incentives, venture capital, and why Web 2.0 operates how it does. It's sufficiently complex, but this is kind of just a snapshot for what Web 2.0 looks like. And then we get Web 3.0 or Web 3. The term emerged, there's different dates that I found, but I think the term actually emerged and came into the scene as something directly related to blockchain around 2014. So John was talking about blockchain as well, being a distributed ledger. So it's this distributed database, and it uses cryptography to ensure data security. And the reason why this is important is because we're now moving away from that Web 2.0 predominant focus on centralized databases that companies are facilitating interactions amongst people. And we can now interact peer-to-peer, person-to-person, without having to negotiate that trust layer because it's baked into the blockchain technology. This is super cool. This means that peer-to-peer interactions can be made, can be facilitated through the internet without trusted third parties. It doesn't mean that we're going to see trusted third parties completely leave the scene. If you think about it, even blockchain, Ethereum, we know those names. They are like a trusted entity. But the interactions, the micro interactions that we have, whether it's making a trade or having conversations through a Web3 platform, these are happening peer to peer. So that trust is kind of baked into the interaction. Again, this is pretty cool, and it changes the whole landscape for how we can use the web to interact. And it's not just for social communication, but also for financial transactions, like John spent over an hour talking about. So we've got this really interesting thing happening with digital technology influencing not only social, but also financial technology as well. So it's kind of this like trifecta of really interesting technical innovation, and it hits on all cylinders. So that's just a bit of background for why I think people lose their minds about crypto and Web3. It's going to change the world. And I think it's because there's so much innovation happening along those three technical areas. So before I conclude, I'm going to jump into a little bit more about social technology and what the implications are on the social side, and talk a little bit about some of the social innovation in Web3. So the first thing that I'm going to do is connect social tech and Web3. So how do you think about social technology aligning with some other kind of tech, a material technology? And digital tech does have a materiality to it. There is a way to work within it. It's just like working in some kind of physical technology of building a house, let's say, architecting things. There's code and there's repositories and there's protocols. They all come together to build a beautiful machine. So the way that social and material interact, I have a quote here from Samo Berja, who is an intelligence analyst and researcher. He has an intelligence agency that informs global leaders in primarily politics and like civilization, like global civilization design. So big thinker. Social and material technologies often act symbiotically, but they are functionally distinct. Much like material technology, social technology is designed, adopted, and scaled. It is proceduralized and documentable. So the point that I'd like everyone to take from this is that social tech is a technology unto itself. There are ways that we can program people at scale for how we move through situations. And that sounds a little bit like we're computers. We're not. So it's a little bit more with the human touch. And I'll give an example. Because it is really hard to describe what social technology is. And I think the reason why it's hard to describe is because, and I'll jump down actually here first, social technology for humans is like water to fish. I have a quote from David Foster Wallace about two young fish swimming along, and they happen upon an older fish swimming the other way who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" Social tech is the same thing for humans. It's everywhere we look. We are inherently social. We've been social since, as a species, we've evolved. So it's one of those things where you kind of take it for granted, even though it's everywhere, until you start noticing the pattern. So social tech is very context dependent, and as many places as you can imagine, you'll find humans. So the example that I have is based on air travel. And if you think about the experience of traveling on an airplane, there's lots of material technology. Going through an airport, that structure had to be built. You're flying in a plane, that structure had to be built, and you're literally flying through the air. Lots of tech goes into that. But the experience of flowing through the airport, of going through security, of getting onto the plane, of going through the travel in the air, someone coming through with a cart and asking if you want to order a drink, deplaning, getting your bags, going to ground transport, all of that had to be designed. People had to get together and think through, what do we want to see socially as far as what these interactions look like? And just like other technologies, it's highly proceduralized. It's very specific. And another little nuance here that I think is nice is that if you've ever traveled abroad and don't understand the local social customs or the language, and language is a social technology, you kind of bump up against the edges, the sort of extreme of what the social technology is trying to funnel you to do, and you don't know quite where to stand. You don't know who to talk to. You're not sure that you're understanding what the experience is that you're supposed to be having. And that is social technology. You're hitting the edge of, I'm not sure what to do with myself, because most of what we do is social. So we'll bring it back to Web3 and come over here. We can see NFTs, which John talked a little bit about, and DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. So we'll take a look at these through the social tech lens now. So NFTs are non-fungible tokens, otherwise known as unique digital objects. John alluded to this as well. It doesn't have to just be art. The way that I look at NFTs as a communication vessel of some sort, you're communicating information, or a vessel for media. So this focus is largely on digital communication. You can bring it out into the real world and have it represent real world items, but I'm focused more on the web space right now. So what we've seen is entire cultural events taking place around NFT collections. John talked about the Bored Ape Yacht Club. There's so many other NFT collections, and I'll have an example for a specific project that I've been involved with. But NFTs can serve in lots of different roles, lots of different social interactions and methods of using NFTs. There's one really interesting use case where you can effectively token gate access to communities, both digitally, where you have to have an NFT in order to enter the community space where people are hanging out. And this is also moved into the real world as well. So you show up for a party and you can't get access unless you show your phone and scan to show that you have the NFT. So there's really interesting social interaction dynamics that we can start shaping and designing with using NFTs. A lot of what we've seen, predominantly all of it, is around art and games, which makes sense. Usually with technical innovations, the artists are out front. They're doing their art, trying to make sense of like how we can see the world through this new lens. But I do think that we'll see in the future really interesting, novel ways of communicating, connecting with people in this peer-to-peer fashion through the web with NFTs in the future. And the example is a game called Exquisite Land, which is a pixel art drawing game. And the way it works is it's a canvas model, and what you're seeing drew. And the game is underpinned by digital technology, blockchain, the way that each tile is shown on the canvas. It's minted to the blockchain. There's a whole process for how this happens. But what's more interesting to me were the rules of gameplay and how tiles were shared and how the tiles connected to one another, what the experience was like in the community drawing these tiles, how people coordinated and worked together. Or in some cases, they didn't. They just drew a tile. They shared, there's a coin dynamic, not a token coin, but kind of a play on that, where you would invite your neighbors and then someone else would show up and continue your drawing without having any verbal communication. So it was just all visually connected. And I'll zoom in a little bit here. So this is that tile, and I drew a little penguin astronaut. My grandmother actually helped art direct this one. She was like very excited about this, and she wanted the penguin astronaut. Okay. And we drew him on a little ledge, and we had no idea that someone was going to come draw a bird. Like that just emerged. So it's very cool to see how these social interactions, again, unplanned. And then another little example I'll point out here along the right-hand side, there's a rocket launch going on, and there was another NFT community who coordinated to make sure that they shared coins with people in the community to get a bunch of tiles in a row so that they could show a rocket launch. So lots of interesting dynamics. Obviously, I mean, this is just an art game, but thinking about the future for how people can communicate with NFTs and coordinate across space and time is pretty cool. And the last thing I'll talk about is more social organization of the entities of people around things like Exquisite Land. And the group that I'm a part of that built Exquisite Land, we don't call ourselves a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization, because we're not really using any blockchain software to make decisions. But some people might consider us a DAO because we're working in the Web3 space. But the idea is that these decentralized autonomous organizations will serve, and in some cases they do already serve, as a form of social organization. It's pretty similar to companies or nonprofits, membership organizations. They're effectively helping people organize in how they work and collaborate together. The focus is on peer-to-peer interactions, though, because it's Web3. So what it's looking like is more of a type of digital cooperative in a way. A lot of the DAOs will use blockchain-backed software to help with those peer-to-peer interactions. So there's less hierarchy because people are working in more of a distributed, equal way to focus their efforts for projects, like voting on proposals for a project, like which project do we want to do next, that kind of thing. How much do we want to pay contributors, actually paying contributors, dissemination of NFTs. John mentioned smart contracts as well. That's usually how these peer-to-peer interactions are programmed so that we can rely on computers to do the things that computers do well and execute, but we tell it what to execute so that you don't have to have people worried about how to tally up the votes, how to execute payments to people that are contributing. Then I have some numbers in here about the financial footprint of DAOs from an organization recently showing between 11 and 12 billion dollars of assets under management. So it's not some small number, and that includes DeFi organizations. It includes NFT projects, social communities. It's basically anything you can think of in the space, and they're probably liberal with the definition of DAO. And the last thing I'll note is, if you've seen one DAO, you've seen one DAO. It's just like companies or organizations. They all look differently. They all structure themselves differently. There's no legal definition of what they are. We're very early. This is something that people talk about in the Web3 space a lot. We're so early, it's one of the memes. And we really are. No one really knows what they're doing. People are organizing on the fly, but in some cases, people are moving around a lot of money. People are moving around really interesting art projects and finding new ways to communicate, and it's a really exciting space to be in. So I'll stop there and see if there's any questions.